Janet Jackson's an interesting phenomenon, and in a lot of ways a very unlikely one, so to speak. Okay, her background needs very little description, but I'm just going to give you a little bit of it to sort of take you there so you can understand why I say that Janet Jackson was very unlikely to achieve and do the things that she did. She came from the Jackson family, America's first family of entertainment, all right? From the Jackson 5, Michael Jackson solo, her sister LaToya, older sister Rebe, who after the success of Michael Jackson got into the music business. So everybody was sort of involved. And of course the patriarch being Joe Jackson, their father and manager. Janet Jackson was kind of, and I didn't coin this term, but this was something that was very well known and popular in the industry, is they called her, and again, this is not me, the normal Jackson. This is what they called her, okay? She was very young, she was tomboyish, and when the Jackson 5 had their variety show in the 70s, her and her brother Randy, who's just older than her, would appear. They do their little skit, which was usually him doing Groucho Marx, and she was doing Mae West. Later on, she appeared on Good Times, Different Strokes. That's when I had my crush on Janet Jackson, when she was on Different Strokes. And then finally, her long-awaited foray into the music business. Now, her first album was actually self-titled, called Janet Jackson. Didn't do much. I think she made one appearance on American Bandstand. Not much happened from it. It was just typical popish R&B. 1983, I believe. 1984, she released her sophomore album called Dream Street. Now, there wasn't much that came out of that except that Jesse Johnson of the time, who were a band produced by Prince, did one or two songs on there, and it sort of introduced her to a new audience with a new production style that she hadn't incorporated into what she was doing. It was the Minneapolis sound, the updated funk sound that was going on at the time. And then finally in 1986 she released Control. A lot of people are not aware that there were actually two albums before Control, because Control was such a phenomenon, which sold in excess of 8 million copies in the US alone. It was produced by Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, which was sort of the follow-up of her working with Jesse Johnson at the time. Now, Jimmy Jam was a keyboardist and Terry Lewis was the bass player at the time, and they were both kicked out by Prince because they were working and producing with other acts, which anybody signed to Prince was not allowed to do. They were producing the SOS Band, Alexander O'Neal. They weren't supposed to be doing that, so they got kicked out. They were replaced. But then it became this production phenomenon. And they were producing, like I said, the SOS Band, Alexander O'Neal, Sherelle, Patty Austin, everybody you could think of in R&B and out of R&B. Human Nature wanted to get funky. The alternative, new wave group from England, they produced them. They produced Lionel Richie's comeback album. But they really came to the pop forefront when they worked with Janet Jackson. And in a way, they kind of were responsible for each other's success, because Janet Jackson had already put out 2 solo albums and nothing really came of it. So the idea was that Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis would produce Janet Jackson with Control, and it would show a side of her that we were not familiar with, because we were, we knew the quiet one, the quote-unquote normal Jackson, so to speak, the baby, and the plan was to bring her out to Minneapolis, where they were based, and to remove all elements that had been associated with her, which at the time meant her father. Now, Joe Jackson, being the patriarch of the Jackson family, he managed his family, who were all artists, with a stranglehold. When he arrived in Minneapolis with Janet Jackson, I'm not going to quote what they said, but basically it was, "Thank you for delivering her. You can go now." And that didn't go over very well. And I think one of the things that they wanted to teach her, she was 18 at the time, I think, was 18, 19, was to teach her how to be a young woman. And they started bringing her out to the malls and bringing her around town. Even brought her to a nightclub where a guy was apparently picking her up, and she kept looking over at them to come and intervene, and they didn't do anything. And finally she, got the guy to leave her alone, and she came back to them. These are her producers now, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis, and said, "Why didn't you guys come help me?" They looked at her and said, "You were fine." They were teaching her how to be a woman. That's what was happening. Henceforth, where the title of the album and one of the hit singles from it, Control, was conceived. And the album had all these sounds of the Minneapolis sound at the time, which Prince had originally constructed, the modern, contemporary, updated funk sound of the mid-1980s. Songs like What Have You Done For Me Lately, Control, Nasty, The Pleasure Principle. The sound was unique, it was irresistible. It was taking a small aspect of Prince's music, but now putting the Jackson imprint on it. And it won all the awards. It sold excess of 8 million copies. Janet Jackson was a superstar. We fast forward now, 3 years later, 1989, and we have the release of Rhythm Nation 1814. And for those of you that don't know, and you should know, it's not very complicated, 1814. R is the 18th letter in the alphabet, and N being the 14th, so it's no real mathematical code. It's Rhythm Nation 1814. You have not just an album which was even probably musically greater and more sophisticated in Control, but you had a concept behind it. The concept was dance, music, but bringing people together, and it was almost like a manifesto for the 90s as we were approaching the 90s. Now, go back a couple of years, and the big female superstar of the 1980s, which a lot of times when we look back and we try to sum up the 1980s, we think of three names: Michael Jackson, Prince, and Madonna. Madonna being from the female side. Somewhere along the lines, Madonna had been used to epitomize what was known as female empowerment in music and entertainment. But really what Madonna was doing was not new. Madonna was sexualizing her music and her image, which of course is something that's not uncommon with past stars like Marilyn Monroe, any of the sex symbols of that time, the pinup girls and whatnot, and even the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, which brought, by the 1970s, pornography to the forefront of almost entering mainstream. I guess case in point is that Madonna was not the embodiment of female empowerment that maybe she thought she was, or that maybe the public tried to make her out to be, because when a woman sexualizes herself, there's nothing empowering about it. Because historically, that's been in entertainment what women have been used for. So in a way, I mean, you know, it maybe meant a lot of money. The empowerment part, no. Because what Madonna had done was not new. And whenever a person sexualizes themselves or makes sexuality the forefront of what it is that they're doing, there's nothing empowering about it, because we're not getting to that person's mind, that person's intellect. Janet Jackson now had brought a new manifesto. And matter of fact, if you look at the first two music videos of Rhythm Nation 1814, Janet is actually dressed like she's in the military. And the dancers are all dressed like they're in the military. And, you know, they got the baseball hats with the silver plaques on it. It says Rhythm Nation and whatnot. So, again, I'll fast forward a little bit. When we look at Beyonce and she's doing Formation, that ain't nothing new. Janet Jackson was doing that in 1989. And of course, that was heavily influenced by things like the Nation of Islam and the Black Panther Party for self-defense and whatnot. That was a true vision of empowerment. And it was done without Janet having to remove her clothing, like Madonna did. It was done without Janet having to sing about sex, which Madonna did. It forced us to look at a female entertainer and a singer and listen to her lyrics as she was expressing her mind and her ideas and her concepts. Dancing and music was used as the catalyst, but really it was about the changing times as we were approaching the 90s decade. That to me was true female empowerment. Well, the interesting thing is that Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis again were hired to produce her album, and great musicianship was brought to that record. And it was also something very unique at the time, because, you know, in hip hop, you had sampling. And you had sampling that was done in a very unique and very creative way. So it wasn't just about taking a record and rapping over, you know, a loop. Hip hop at the time would find a lot of rare records, you know, whether you're talking about James Brown or P-Funk or Sly or whatever it could be. In the case of De La Soul, Johnny Cash, Sesame Street records. And there was a mixture of that on Rhythm Nation. Live music, live instrumentation mixed with samples. Rhythm Nation, the title track itself, was live music featuring a sample of Sly and the Family Stone's "Thank You for Letting Me Be Myself Again." So musically, although Control was great, and it was an offshoot of what was going on with the Minneapolis sound and style, Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis had now upped the ante with their production style. So did Janet Jackson. There was also a song on the album called Black Cat, which was produced by Jelly Bean Johnson, who was part of the camp, who was the drummer for the time, which was a heavy rock track. So now Janet was stepping into territory that people like Prince and Michael Jackson were by entering the rock market as well. The ballads also started to try and showcase Janet's voice a little bit more, although Janet Jackson not being the strongest vocalist. I think probably some of her best vocal performances were on Rhythm Nation. And I think that the concept behind it, and you got to look at everything that was going on at the time. You know, MC Hammer had brought a lot of choreography and dance to rap music and hip hop. And then you had a lot of throwback groups like Delight, who were taking the ideas and the looks of the 60s with songs like Groove Is in the Heart. And they were incorporating this new sample style and this new funk and dance music style. And you had things like C&C Music Factory, a Snap, Black Box. Janet Jackson had taken a lot of these influences along with Jimmy Jam and Terry Lewis and created something new out of it. And we were now witnessing, believe it or not, with Rhythm Nation, the first time we saw, in ages anyway, a popular female star whose calling card in this whole concept in the album was the music, not her sexuality. This was very unique for the time. Janet Jackson took a page from her brother's book, Michael. We can't get away from that. It is her brother. And she took the whole choreography thing, which Michael basically laid the blueprint for in the video Beat It. And, you know, Beat It was kind of cute, but it was also kind of corny. It's supposed to be like gang members fighting each other, but the gang members look like ballet dancers, which they were. Janet Jackson took this very serious. They mixed aspects of that choreography from Michael Jackson's videos, but there was a lot of stepping in it as well. A lot of military drills that, or at least influenced by military drills and that sort of thing. And that became, in essence, a calling card of everything that would follow for her, even on subsequent albums that would be released after that. Choreography was a big part of what Janet Jackson was doing, and it brought it to a whole other level. I think the fact that also a lot of girls who are not size zero, who are not willing to get naked just to get a hit record or to become a star, could relate to Janet Jackson because she was like everybody else. She was a beautiful young lady, but she didn't dress half naked. She still had a little bit of that baby fat going on. She had those cheeks and everything, and she was cute. And at the same time, it was a real representation of female pride, girl power, before Spice Girls were even, thought of. Janet Jackson was showing real girl power and concepts and ideas. If you look at the liner notes of Rhythm Nation 1814, or even the lyrics to the actual song itself, it looks like a manifesto of a new nation whose barriers would be broken down. We would have new views and concepts on race, on gender, on sexuality, on ideas, on politics. And in a way, it was the first thinking album, if you will, from a young feminine point of view and perspective. Well, with Janet Jackson winning every award that you can imagine, having sold excess of 100 million albums, continuing to tour at 50, and now apparently canceling a tour because she's about to have a baby, it's hard to see her as underrated in any shape or form. She's been given every accolade, every award you can imagine. I mean, comparing her to Michael Jackson is like saying, well, you're a king, but we're going to compare you to an emperor. Well, being a king is somewhat of an accomplishment in itself anyway. I think if you try to compare anybody to Michael Jackson, having the impact that he had on the world, many are going to pale. But I don't think that Janet Jackson has been underrated in any way, because so many people have given props to her. So many people have called her name as a major influence. And all you got to do is watch any music video from any artist I mean, Beyonce just trying to do what Janet Jackson was doing 20, 25 years ago. And, you know, they say, you know, copying is a form of flattery, it's a form of respect. I wouldn't say she was underrated. I think trying to connect anybody with Michael Jackson is a losing battle anyway with his popularity. But I think she's more than been given her respect and accolades of an artist. The irony behind it all is that Janet Jackson would follow up Rhythm Nation with the album simply called Janet, all in lowercase letters. And it was ironic enough that that was the album where Janet began to become very sexualized, began to pose close to nude, and the music became very sexual during that time period. And to be fair, not unlike a lot of the other stuff that was coming out during that time. But I think that the impact later on, I think, started to wane a little bit. And it's only natural that when you go back to how the industry likes to portray women, we can go back and use the same example of how the industry used to like to portray black people. We go back to the 1970s. In black film, you have what was called the blaxploitation era. You didn't have films of black people portraying lawyers and doctors and police officers. During the blaxploitation era, films like Shaft and Superfly and Black Caesar, Hell Up in Harlem, our black heroes during that time were either drug dealers, were either pimps, negative stereotype images of African Americans during that time. It wasn't until the advent of people like Spike Lee and later on so many other people that stereotype and that image changed in film. Well, with women, it was the same thing. Women were always either the backup singer or they were very heavily sexualized. And again, I would have preferred Janet Jackson having continued to elevate herself with the origins of where she started with Control and Rhythm Nation, and take that female empowerment from a young lady's point of view to an older woman's point of view. But it's ironic that as she continued to get older, she started to take off her clothes more and more. The music began to be more sexual more and more. And not to say that there wasn't great music made during that time, because there was, because the Janet album had great songs like That's the Way Love Goes, but it also had a song called New Agenda with Chuck D, which was about black female empowerment, albeit she was doing it half naked. I think that Janet Jackson did reach the high point of her career artistically, creatively, and ideologically during the albums of Control and Rhythm Nation. And who knows if a new project will come out after she starts her family and whatnot, will be a return to that. Because the same way that during the blaxploitation era in hip hop, in film, and then you fast forward to the gangster rap era in hip hop, socially conscious artists like Public Enemy, De La Soul, Tribe Called Quest, Jungle Brothers, KRS-One, Boogie Down Productions were replaced by characters that the industry wanted to sell. And there's a very, very concentrated effort to do that. Because when you take a certain stereotype and a certain image, you can sell that to a certain audience that is not as demanding of the content. So it's much easier to sell a lot of negative, unsocially conscious music in hip hop than it is. And I think in the music industry, it's a lot easier to sell a woman who's half naked rather than a woman who's demanding to be listened to for her mind and her musical concepts from that point of view. But yeah, I would say that probably was the high point of her career, and I'm looking forward to her maybe one day returning to that era.